Malcolm Reeves walked out of the Halden Vista Tower with a rejection letter in his pocket. Inside that room, the head of human resources had leaned back in her chair and delivered her verdict without blinking. "You're simply not the right fit for our environment, Mr. Reeves." No question, no apology. Just a dismissal dressed in professional courtesy, while the man beside her turned his eyes back to the table, like Malcolm wasn't worth the effort of sustained eye contact. He thanked them anyway, picked up his folder, and walked out. He stopped once in a back hallway to help an old janitor. Nobody else had bothered with something small, something quiet, something no one was supposed to see. He thought that was the end. Then the CEO of Halden Vista came running out the front entrance, calling his name across a crowded Charlotte street. What exactly had that old janitor seen, and what did he tell her? If you're new here, this channel is where we tell the stories of people who were counted out and proved the count wrong. Hit subscribe. Before this one is over, because this story is just getting started, and you're going to want to be here for what happens next. Malcolm Reeves had learned a long time ago that dignity was not something the world handed you. It was something you built quietly in the dark when nobody was watching and nothing was going your way. He built it every morning at 5:30 when he got up before Zoe made her lunch, checked her inhaler, and pressed his one good suit for whatever the day required. He built it every night after she fell asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a textbook and a cup of cold coffee, working through certification modules while the rest of Charlotte slept. It wasn't a heroic life. It was just his life, and he carried it with both hands. His apartment was on the east side of Charlotte, the kind of building where the elevator was always one bad week away from being out of service, and the hallway lights flickered in cold weather. Zoe had grown up in that apartment, and she knew every corner of it the way children know the places that raised them. She was 8 years old and already too observant for her own good. She noticed that her father resold the same pair of shoes twice. She noticed that he always said he wasn't hungry when there wasn't quite enough for 2 full portions. She noticed, and she never said a word, because even at 8, Zoe understood that some things were carried so the other person wouldn't have to. Malcolm had not always lived this way. He had once been good at his work in ways that felt solid and real, managing operations, untangling systems, finding the inefficiencies that cost companies time and money, and fixing them without fanfare. He wasn't the kind of person who needed recognition. He just needed the work to matter. And then one Tuesday afternoon, a driver ran a red light, and his wife Diana was gone, and Zoe was 3 years old, and everything that came after was shaped by a single decision Malcolm made before the funeral was even over. He would leave his job and raise his daughter himself. Not because there was no other choice. Because it was the right thing, and he had always believed the right thing and the hard thing were usually the same thing. The years that followed were hard to explain to people who hadn't lived them. He took whatever work he could find around Zoe's school schedule. The most meaningful stretch had been volunteering to build a free distribution system for a network of community health clinics. No budget, no team, just Malcolm, and a problem that needed solving. The system eventually served thousands of low-income families across 2 counties, getting medications to people who had been falling through the cracks for years. He documented the entire architecture clearly enough that the clinics could maintain it without him. But it hadn't come with a title. And in the world of corporate hiring, work without a title barely counted at all. When he found the Halden Vista posting, he read it 3 times before he allowed himself to feel anything close to hope. The company was run by Camille Sterling, a black woman who had built one of the most respected logistics and technology firms in the Southeast. Halden Vista supplied hospitals, school systems, emergency transport networks. The work was real, and it reached people who needed it. Malcolm met every technical qualification on the list. More than that, he had lived those qualifications. He set his alarm for 4:45. The morning of the interview, kissed Zoe on the forehead while she was still half asleep, and walked to the bus stop in the early light with his folder under his arm and something that felt cautiously like possibility. He arrived at the Halden Vista Tower a full hour before his scheduled time. The lobby was all glass and polished concrete, the kind of space designed to make a person feel the gap between where they were and where the building assumed they should be. Malcolm found a chair near the window and sat with his folder on his lap, watching the morning shift of employees badge through the turnstiles in their tailored jackets and wireless earbuds moving with the easy confidence of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged in a room. He told himself it didn't matter. He knew what he knew. He had done what he had done. The receptionist called his name at 9 sharp and he followed her to the 11th floor. The conference room had a long table and 3 people seated on the far side of it. Beverly Crane, the head of human resources, sat in the center. She was polished in the way of someone who had spent years learning how to make professional courtesy function as a wall warm enough to seem reasonable, measured enough to be impossible to argue with. To her left was Landon Pike, the head of operations, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s who leaned back in his chair with the posture of someone who had already formed his opinion and was simply waiting for the formality to confirm it. On Beverly's right was Scott Ralston, a senior manager who barely looked up when Malcolm sat down. His eyes moved once over the folder, the suit, the shoes, a quick inventory, and then he turned his gaze back to the table and picked up his pen. Malcolm introduced himself. Beverly smiled and said they were glad he could come in. The first few questions were standard background experience approach to logistics systems. Malcolm answered clearly and without embellishment. He described his work with the community health clinics in enough detail to demonstrate that he understood supply chain architecture at a level that went beyond theory, that he had built something from nothing and made it work under real constraints. Landon let him finish, then tilted his head slightly and asked what relevant experience he had in a high-volume corporate environment specifically. The emphasis on the last word was subtle but deliberate. Malcolm said that the principles were the same regardless of scale and that he had applied them successfully in contexts where the stakes were higher than quarterly targets because the people depending on the system didn't have the option of waiting for the next fiscal year. Landon nodded slowly with the expression of a man absorbing information he had no intention of using. Beverly moved the conversation toward the gap in Malcolm's employment record. She framed it gently the way people frame things when they want to seem fair while making a point they've already decided to make. She said the panel had noticed a significant period where his professional activity was difficult to assess and asked if he could speak to that. Malcolm told the truth. He said his wife had died. His daughter had been 3 years old, and he had made the decision to be present for her during the years she needed him most. He said he had not stopped learning or working. During that time, he had simply done it outside of the environments that generated the kind of documentation hiring panels looked for. He said it plainly without apology because it was the plain truth. Scott Ralston wrote something on his notepad. Beverly said she appreciated him sharing that, and her voice carried the particular warmth of someone who has already moved on internally while still maintaining eye contact. The remaining questions were shorter, more procedural. The energy in the room had shifted in the way it shifts when a group of people have reached a conclusion and are simply completing the steps required before they can act on it. When Beverly told him the panel would be in touch, Malcolm understood what that meant. He had understood it for the last 15 minutes. He thanked each of them by name. Beverly Landon. Scott stood up, collected his folder, and walked out of the room. He did not let anything show on his face because his face was not theirs to read. The service hallway ran behind the main lobby, connecting the freight elevator to a set of storage rooms near the building's east exit. Malcolm had taken a wrong turn looking for the stairwell and found himself in a corridor that smelled of cleaning solution and old cardboard. He was about to double back when he heard the sound, a heavy crash, followed by the lower, quieter sound of something going wrong that nobody was going to come running to fix. Otis Bell was on his hands and knees in the middle of the hallway. He was a lean man somewhere in his late 60s with silver hair cropped close and the kind of hands that told you everything about how he had spent his working life, thick across the knuckles, scarred in places, the hands of a man who had been useful to people for decades without ever being particularly celebrated for it. His cart had collapsed on one side, a wheel sheared clean off at the axle, and a large storage box had toppled with it, scattering documents across the floor. He was trying to gather them without fully getting up, moving slowly, his face tight with the particular embarrassment of needing help in a place where help was not coming. 3 employees had already walked past. One had glanced over and kept moving. Another had sighed audibly at the obstruction. Malcolm set his folder against the wall. He crossed the hallway, crouched down, and started picking up papers. Otis looked up, startled. Malcolm didn't say anything grand about it. He just started ordering the documents by the numbering printed in their corners, the way he would have organized anything that needed organizing. Otis watched him for a moment, then started working alongside him, and the two of them cleared the floor together without much ceremony. The wheel was a simple enough problem. Malcolm carried a small toolkit in the inside pocket of his jacket, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because things broke, and he had learned a long time ago that the person who could fix the thing was usually the person who had thought to bring the means to fix it. He crouched beside the cart, assessed the shear point, and rigged the wheel back into position well enough that it would hold for the rest of the day. It was while he was repositioning the fallen box that he noticed the shipping label. He recognized the code format because he had spent years working with logistics documentation. The prefix designated sensitive medical contract materials, the kind that required chain of custody tracking. But the destination code on the label was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong in a way that would have sent the box to a general receiving dock instead of a secured compliance office where its contents, patient data tied to a major hospital contract, would have sat in an open intake area until someone noticed. Malcolm did not make a scene. He took the label off carefully, showed Otis the error, and explained in plain terms what the correct code should be and why it mattered. Otis listened with the attention of someone who understood that what he was being told was important, even if the details were outside his expertise. Malcolm wrote the corrected routing information on the back of a page from his folder, handed it to Otis, and told him to bring it to whoever handled compliance intake before the cart went back into rotation. Then he picked up his folder, said it was good to meet him, and walked toward the exit. He did not leave his name. He did not look back. There was no one in that hallway who was going to remember him, and that was fine. He had not done it to be remembered. Outside, the Charlotte sun was already high and hot, and the city moved around him with complete indifference. And Malcolm Reeves walked toward the bus stop with the quiet, worn knowledge that he had done the right thing in there in both rooms, and that it had not been enough, and that he was going to have to figure out what came next. The pharmacy on Central Avenue was 3 blocks from the bus stop, and Malcolm went there before he went anywhere else. He stood at the counter and watched the pharmacist ring up Zoe's inhaler refill, and when the total came up on the screen, he did the math in his head without meaning to, what was left in his account, what was due at the end of the week, what could wait, and what couldn't. The inhaler couldn't wait. The electricity bill could wait one more cycle. He paid, put the bag in his jacket pocket, and walked back out into the afternoon heat. He sat down on a bench outside the pharmacy and let himself be still for a moment. Not defeated, he wasn't ready to call it that, but the weight of the morning had settled into his shoulders in a way that wasn't going anywhere soon. He had been in that conference room for less than 40 minutes. 40 minutes for 3 people to look at everything he had built and decide it didn't add up to enough. And the part that sat heaviest wasn't the rejection itself. It was the specific texture of it, the way Beverly had smiled, the way Scott had turned his eyes back to the table, the way Landon had nodded with that expression that said he had already written the ending before Malcolm had finished his first sentence. They hadn't evaluated him. They had confirmed what they already believed. He thought about Zoe waiting at school, expecting him to come home with something to show for the morning. She never said it out loud, but he knew she watched his face the second he walked through the door, reading it the way she had learned to read it over years of watching her father carry things he didn't name. He would have to find a way to come through that door tonight, without letting her see all of it. He put the pharmacy bag in his jacket pocket beside the toolkit and stood up. On the 11th floor of the Halden Vista Tower, Otis Bell did not go back to the service corridor after Malcolm left. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, holding the corrected routing information Malcolm had written on the back of a folder page, and thought about what had just happened. Then he took the freight elevator to the 14th floor. He had worked in this building for 11 years. Before that, he had worked for Camille Sterling's family before Halden Vista was Halden Vista, back when it was a 3-person operation running out of a rented office with folding tables and a shared printer. He had watched Camille build the company floor by floor, decision by decision, with the kind of focus that came from knowing exactly what you were working toward and why it mattered. Over all those years, Otis had become the kind of presence in the building that people forgot about until they needed something, a quiet, reliable constant in the background of a company that was always moving fast. Camille had never forgotten about him. She was one of the few people in the building who knew his last name without having to check a directory. He knocked on the frame of her open office door. Camille was at her desk reviewing a contract binder, and she looked up with the particular attention she gave to things that arrived without an appointment. Otis told her what had happened. He described the cart, the documents on the floor, the employees who had walked past. He described the man who had stopped the one in the older suit with the folder under his arm, the one who had clearly just come from somewhere upstairs and was clearly on his way out of the building for good. He told her about the toolkit, about the wheel, about the mislabeled shipping box. And then he told her what the man had said about the label, not in technical language, but in the plain, careful way of someone who understood the system well enough to explain it simply, and wanted to make sure Otis understood it too, because the information needed to reach the right place, and Otis was the one who was going to carry it there. Camille set down her pen. She asked if the man had given his name. Otis said he hadn't, but that he had come from upstairs, and given the timing, it wasn't hard to figure out. Camille pulled up the morning's interview schedule on her screen. There had been 4 candidates. 3 of them were still in the building or had left through the main lobby with scheduled follow-up calls already in the calendar. The 4th was Malcolm Reeves, who had been released before 10 o'clock. She pulled his file. She had not looked at it before. That was what the hiring panel was for. She trusted her people to run the process, and she stayed out of it unless a decision came to her escalated. This one had not been escalated. It had simply been concluded. She read through it now, and the further she read, the quieter the room became around her. The community health clinic project was buried in the supplemental materials section, the part applicants were allowed to include, but panels rarely read in full. She read the project summary twice. He had built a distribution and routing system for 7 clinics across 2 counties with no budget, no staff, and no institutional support, and the system was still running. Thousands of patients had received medications on time who had not been receiving them before. He had documented the entire architecture clearly enough that the clinics could maintain it without him. It was, in practical terms, exactly the kind of operational problem-solving that Halden Vista's Community Logistics Division had been struggling to replicate at scale for the better part of 2 years. She requested the hallway footage from building security. The timestamp put Malcolm in the service corridor at 9:52 in the morning, 11 minutes after leaving the conference room. The footage was grainy in the way of secondary corridor cameras, but it was clear enough. She watched him set his folder against the wall and cross the hallway without hesitating. She watched him work alongside Otis, not performing helpfulness, not making a show of it, just doing what needed doing with the same economy of movement as someone solving a problem they had encountered before. She watched him examine the shipping label, write something down, hand it to Otis, say a few words, and leave. He had walked out of a building that had just dismissed him, and on his way through the back corridor quietly prevented what would have been a serious compliance breach. He hadn't reported it to the front desk. He hadn't asked to speak to a supervisor. He had given the information to the person standing in front of him and trusted that person to carry it forward. Camille closed the folder and called Beverly Crane. Beverly arrived first, then Landon Pike, then Scott Ralston, all 3 of them carrying the slightly guarded energy of people who have been summoned without context and are working out whether they're in trouble. Camille had the file open on the table and the hallway footage loaded on her laptop screen. She did not raise her voice. She almost never did. She asked them to walk her through the decision on Malcolm Reeves. Beverly spoke first in the smooth, even tone she used for situations that required careful framing. She said the candidate had an extensive gap in his professional record, limited recent experience in a high-volume corporate environment, and that the panel had collectively assessed his profile as carrying more risk than the position required. She said it with the confidence of someone who had said similar things many times and never been asked to look more closely. Camille let her finish. Then she asked Landon to explain what he had meant specifically by high-volume corporate environment and how that criterion had been weighted against the candidate's demonstrated ability to design and implement an operational system that was still functioning effectively years after its creation with no ongoing institutional support. Landon shifted slightly in his chair. He said the panel had focused on recent relevant experience in comparable settings. Camille turned the laptop screen so all three of them could see the footage. She let it run for 90 seconds, long enough to show Malcolm setting down his folder, crossing the hallway, and getting to work. And then she closed the laptop. She told them that the man they had released that morning had, on his way out of the building, identified a compliance error that would have sent sensitive medical contract documentation to an unsecured receiving dock. She said that error would have cost the company no less than a breach notification process, potential regulatory exposure, and the kind of reputational damage with their hospital partners that took years to repair. She said he had not reported it to the front desk, had not sought any acknowledgement, had simply made sure it was corrected and left. She said she wanted them to think about what it meant that a man who had just been told he wasn't good enough for this company had in the same hour demonstrated more operational instinct and professional character than most people showed in a month of working there. The room was quiet in the particular way of people who are not yet ready to say they were wrong, but are no longer sure enough of themselves to say they were right. Camille said she was not asking for a defense of the process. She was telling them that the process had failed, and that they were going to examine how and why, and that it was going to result in changes she expected all three of them to be part of. Then she picked up her phone and went to find Malcolm herself. Malcolm was sitting at the bus stop on Tryon Street when his phone buzzed twice in his pocket. The first message was from his landlord. Rent was 9 days overdue, and the next step would involve a formal notice. The second was from Zoe's school. Zoe had had a mild asthma episode during afternoon recess, and the nurse was asking someone to come pick her up early. He was on his feet before he finished reading the second message. The afternoon bus was 4 minutes out. He put the phone back in his pocket and stood at the curb, and for just a moment, just a few seconds before the next thing required his attention, he let himself feel the full weight of the day. The rent notice, the inhaler in his pocket, the conference room, the 40 minutes it had taken 3 people to look at his life and find it insufficient. He had done everything right. He had shown up early, prepared, honest, and professional. He had kept his dignity in a room that had not offered him much reason to. He had stopped in a hallway and done the right thing because it was the right thing, not because anyone would see it. And still, at the end of all of it, he was standing at a bus stop calculating whether he could cover next month's rent if he picked up overnight shifts at a distribution warehouse on the south side, work that would mean Zoe spent more evenings alone, which was the one cost he had never been willing to pay if he could help it. He was stepping toward the curb as the bus pulled up. Behind him, from the direction of the Halden Vista Tower, came the sound of heels moving fast on pavement, faster than heels were built to move the sharp, uneven rhythm of someone running without having planned to run. Then a voice, clear and direct, cutting through the ambient noise of the afternoon street. "Malcolm Reeves!" He turned around. The woman coming toward him across the sidewalk was not someone he recognized by face, but he recognized the authority in the way she moved, the way people moved, when they were used to rooms reconfiguring themselves around their presence. She was in her mid-50s, black with close-cropped natural hair and a charcoal blazer, and she was walking toward him with the kind of focused intention that made the other pedestrians on the sidewalk step aside without quite knowing why. There was no assistant with her, no security detail, nobody carrying anything on her behalf. Just the woman herself, slightly out of breath, having clearly left the building without preparing for what came after she got outside. Malcolm had never seen Camille Sterling in person. He had only seen the professional headshot on the Halden Vista website, the one where she looked composed and deliberate and entirely in control of whatever room she was standing in. The woman in front of him looked like that same person mid-stride through something she had decided to do before she had fully worked out what she was going to say when she got there. The bus doors opened behind him. Malcolm did not get on. She stopped a few feet in front of him, close enough that he could see she had come down without her badge, without her phone, without any of the apparatus that usually surrounded people at her level when they moved through the world. She had just come. Whatever had sent her out the door had moved faster than preparation. Camille Sterling looked at him directly the way people do when they have decided that the only way through something is straight through it. She told him she owed him an apology. Not from the company, from her specifically, because the company was hers, and what happened inside it was her responsibility, and what had happened that morning was wrong. She said it without softening it into something more comfortable. The hiring panel had not evaluated him. They had looked at the shape of his life and decided it didn't match the image they had in their heads, and they had dressed that decision up in language that sounded like professional judgment, and she had not been in the room to stop it, because she had trusted a process that had failed him. Malcolm listened. He stood with his folder at his side and his hands still and his face giving nothing away, the same face he had worn in the conference room when Beverly had told him he wasn't the right fit. He had spent years learning how to keep his reactions from becoming other people's entertainment. And that habit didn't turn off just because the person in front of him was apologizing instead of dismissing. When Camille finished, he asked her one question. "Are you out here because you feel bad about what happened?" Or he had read his full file, the parts her panel hadn't bothered with, and she had understood within about 4 minutes that her company had just turned away someone who had done more meaningful operational work in an underfunded community setting than most of the people currently on her payroll had done with full institutional support behind them. She said the compliance error he had caught in the service corridor would have... Then he said he was listening. Camille's offer was specific, which mattered. Vague offers from people trying to correct a mistake had a particular texture full of good intentions and short on structure designed more to relieve the guilt of the person giving than to actually serve the person receiving. This was not that. She had a role in Mind Operations Strategy Associate within Halden Vista's Community Logistics Division, the branch of the company that managed supply chains for hospitals, schools, and low-income service networks. The salary was enough to cover rent utilities, Zoe's medical costs, and something left over. The benefits package included full health coverage for dependents. The schedule was designed with flexibility built in, not as an exception to be negotiated every time something came up with a child, but as a structural feature of how the division operated. Malcolm asked how soon. She said she wanted him in the building by the following Monday. He told her he needed to pick up his daughter first. She had had an asthma episode at school that afternoon and was waiting for him. Camille said of course. She said to take care of Zoe first and that she would have a formal offer in his email by the time he got home. There was a moment between them that didn't need to be filled with anything, two people standing on a sidewalk in Charlotte, one of whom had just changed the other's life, both of them clear-eyed enough to understand what had nearly not happened. Then Malcolm nodded once, tucked his folder more firmly under his arm, and turned toward the next bus stop down the block. Camille watched him go, and then she turned and walked back toward the building she ran. Back on the 14th floor, 3 people were still waiting in the conference room. Beverly, Landon, and Scott had not been dismissed after Camille left to find Malcolm. They had been told to stay, and they had stayed, which said something about what they understood the situation to be. When Camille returned and sat back down at the head of the table, she told them the position had been filled. Then she told them what came next. The hiring process for positions with community impact responsibility was going to be redesigned from the ground up, and all 3 of them were going to be part of that redesign, whether they found it comfortable or not. The criteria for evaluating candidates with non-traditional career paths. People who had taken time away to care for family members. People who had done significant work in community or volunteer settings. People whose experience didn't come packaged in the logos of companies that other companies recognized. Those criteria were going to be built explicitly into the evaluation framework, not left to individual panel judgment. She said judgment was exactly what had failed that morning, and judgment without structure was just bias wearing a professional suit. Landon started to say something about the importance of maintaining standards. Camille stopped him with a look that did not require volume to be effective. She said standards were not the problem. The problem was that they had confused familiarity with quality and comfort with competence, and they had done it to a man who had walked into that building better prepared than they were to assess him. She said Landon specifically would be working directly with Malcolm once he came aboard, and that she expected that relationship to be professional, constructive, and conducted without any residue of the morning's decision. She was not asking for agreement. She was describing what was going to happen. The meeting ended without anyone in the room feeling particularly good about themselves, which was appropriate. Some corrections were supposed to feel like corrections. Zoe was sitting in the nurse's office with her inhaler in her lap and a paper cup of water on the table beside her when Malcolm arrived at the school. She looked up when he came through the door, and her face did the thing it always did when she saw him, the slight easing around the eyes, the small exhale, the look of a child who had been holding something in place by herself and could now set it down. She was fine. The episode had been miled over in a few minutes, nothing like the bad ones from 2 years ago. But the school had protocols, and Malcolm was glad they followed them. He crouched down in front of her chair and checked her breathing the way he had learned to do, listening, watching the rise and fall of her chest, running a quick hand along her back. She led him patient in the way she was always patient with his worry. "I'm okay, Dad," she said. He told her he knew. He kept his hand on her back for another few seconds anyway. On the bus ride home, Zoe sat beside him with her head tilted against his arm, half watching the city move past the window. She didn't ask about the interview right away. She had always known when to let things settle before she poked at them. It was one of the things about her that still surprised him sometimes, this innate sense of timing, this understanding that some things needed space before they could be spoken. After a while, without looking up from the window, she asked if the day had been okay. Malcolm thought about the conference room. He thought about Beverly's careful smile and Scott's notepad and Landon's expression of a man who had already decided. He thought about the service hallway and Otis on his hands and knees and the mislabeled box that had been 2 inches away from going somewhere it should never have gone. He thought about a woman in a charcoal blazer coming out the front door of a building at full stride, running after someone the building had just decided didn't belong there. He told Zoe that someone had seen him today, really seen him, and that it had changed things. She looked up at him then. She studied his face the way she always studied it, reading what was actually there rather than what was being offered for presentation. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. She put her head back against his arm and said, "Okay." And that was enough for both of them. The months that followed didn't transform Malcolm's life in the dramatic, sudden way that stories sometimes promise. What happened was quieter and more durable than that. He came into the community logistics division and did what he had always done. He paid attention. He identified what wasn't working and he fixed it. The medical supply routing project he developed over his first several months restructured the delivery network for underserved residential areas across 4 districts, places where families, many of them black, many of them working multiple jobs with no margin for error, had been falling through the gaps of a system that had been designed without them clearly in mind. The project worked because Malcolm understood those gaps from the inside. He had lived adjacent to them for years. He knew what it cost a family to miss a medication delivery, not in the abstract language of impact metrics, but in the specific, human weight of what that actually meant for a child with asthma or an elderly parent managing a chronic condition alone. Halden Vista launched a new hiring initiative in the spring, a formal program for candidates with interrupted career paths, for single parents, for people whose most significant work had happened outside the walls of institutions that generated the kind of credentials hiring panels recognized on site. Otis Bell was invited to speak at the internal launch event. He wore a pressed shirt and said very little because he was not a man who needed many words to make a point. He said he had worked in this building for 11 years, and in all that time only one person had ever stopped in that back hallway to help him when something went wrong. He said he thought that was worth paying attention to. Landon Pike sat in the 3rd row during that event and did not say anything afterward. But over the following months, working alongside Malcolm on the routing project, something in the way he engaged began to shift slowly without announcement, the way real changes tend to happen in people who are paying honest attention. By the time the project reached its first major milestone, he was the one presenting Malcolm's work to the executive team with a conviction that didn't require prompting. On the day the project was formally unveiled at a company event, Malcolm brought Zoe. She stood beside him in the main lobby of the Halden Vista Tower, the same lobby where the turnstiles had clicked and the morning employees had moved in their easy, purposeful way. The same building where a panel of 3 people had told her father he wasn't what they were looking for. And she looked up at the display board where the new initiative was listed with its lead architect's name printed clearly: Malcolm Reeves. Community Logistics Strategy. Zoe read it twice. Then she reached up and took her father's hand and held it and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. Some things were simply true now, and the best thing you could do with them was stand next to them and let them be true. Malcolm looked down at his daughter at the top of her head, and her small hand in his, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not relief exactly. Something more solid than relief. The feeling of a man who had carried the right things through the hard years and arrived finally somewhere that could hold the weight of what he'd brought with him. Malcolm's story isn't really about getting a second chance. It's about what happens when a person refuses to let a bad room define them, when they walk out of a door that just closed in their face and still stop to help someone on the way out. Most of us have been in that hallway at some point. Most of us know what it feels like to be measured by the wrong things, by people who stopped looking before they really saw us. And most of us know deep down that the truest version of who we are shows up not when someone is watching and grading us, but in the quiet moments when we simply choose to do right because it's right. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. Because this channel exists for exactly these stories, the ones about people who were counted out who kept going anyway, and who proved that character is the one thing a rejection letter cannot take from you. We'll see you in the next one.